come up out of your life of prayer and then apply that to whatever the Lord has given you to do. And never say, oh, this is, what good is this? No, it belongs to the very creativity of God, participates in it. And God has given you this work to do on behalf of people. And it might be, putting together a camera. It might be sewing clothes. But whatever it is you're doing, if it's done with dignity and with truth and with a sense of its loving purpose, that's beautiful. That's sanctified.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the Senior Publishing Director at Word on Fire. Is work something good or something bad? Is it central to being human, or is it a punishment resulting from sin? And how do we understand work theologically in relation to God? That's what we'll be discussing today with Bishop Robert Barron, joining us from Rochester, Minnesota. Bishop, good to be with you as always.
Hey, Brandon, how are you and the kids doing?
Yeah, we're doing really well. We just got back from our long cross-country road trip. We drove all the way out to Denver to have our boys attend Camp Wojtyła.
Yeah.
Big shout out to the good folks out there. And then we stopped by and saw you and Father Steve for a while there
in
Mount
Minnesota. Rushmore before us, right? And then you went to Chicago and then back to Florida.
Right. That's right. It was quite an adventure, but you yourself are just wrapping up a vacation too. Tell us about that. How's it been? Have you read any good books during your vacation?
Well, I have. The vacation, I just did a staycation here because I travel so much, the thought of getting on an airplane and going somewhere. So I just stayed here at my home in Minnesota and for a couple weeks really, and the weather was great. And I did read things that that are not connected to projects. It would just be, for fun. One is the intellectual autobiography of the great Peter Brown. Peter Brown, the Oxford historian that wrote the definitive biography of Augustine. I'm blanking on the title of the book right now. A big fat book, and it's if you like the life of the mind as I do, and you like universities and libraries and conferences, it's a guy telling you the story of how his mind has kind of evolved over the decades, and the people he knew and all that. So I was reading that, and let's see, what else during the vacation was I reading? I read a book on
Girard book you were reading.
Yeah, that's right. I got that book on Girard. It's a collection of his shorter pieces and aphorisms, and that was quite fine. And I read that biography of Russell Kirk by Brad Burtzer. When I was down at Hillsdale College, he gave me a beautiful hardcover, leather-bound version of it. So I've been reading that too for fun. So anyway, the vacation was great.
Well, speaking of books, a new book just arrived at the Word on Fire offices, which we're all very proud of. It is called The Theology of Bishop Barron, and it's written by the esteemed Catholic theologian Matthew Levering. This is not just a biography of you, Bishop, but what it does is explore the key themes of your theological vision and traces your development as a theologian from the 1970s to the 80s to the present. But the unique way that Levering has structured this book is by putting you in critical engagement with a whole cast of characters from your formative period, including Andrew Greeley, Michael Corban, Raymond Brown, Edward Skilebex, John Meyer, George Lensbeck, Alistair McIntyre, Stanley Hauerwas, and Richard Rohr. So a very eclectic group of thinkers. But what he does is show how you appropriated, elaborated, and often critiqued the thought of these interlocutors to develop a nuanced theology of your own. So tell us about this book and your thoughts about it, and Matthew Levering as the author.
Well, I guess I'm simultaneously embarrassed by it and very proud of it, because I think you and Matt and some others approached me a while ago about, the prospect of doing this book. And, of course, I love Matt Levering. He's, I think, one of the brightest theologians writing today. He's published a number of things for us, but he to me is the successor of Avery Dulles, meaning someone that knows how to read the theological scene and really sum it up in a helpful way. He's one of the great teachers of theology on the scene today. So I was, very flattered that he wanted to work on my book, on my work. What he does, and you hint at it there, is he knows so well all the people that over the years I've been reading. And so when you read something that I write, he can say, oh, that's from McIntyre, oh, that's Hauerwas, but now cautioned by Aquinas, and oh, that's Aquinas, but but now the fathers are coming into play in a way that kind of, checks that perspective. And he's very good at knowing the people that I read. Probably for a lot of my readers, I have footnotes and things, but they might not be all that interested in the footnotes. Matt loves footnotes, so he'll go through all of that material. So I think if you are interested in figuring out, where my thinking has come from, how it's evolved, it's a very useful study. I did read it, in manuscript form, but I kind of on purpose backed away from it. I didn't want to, say to Matt, oh, you'd be able to change this or that's not. I just sort of let it go and let him, give his interpretation, which I very much appreciate.
So it's a fine book. Again, it's called The Theology of Bishop Barron by Matthew Levering, and it just came out today, actually, Monday, August 28th. All right, Bishop. Well, as we are approaching Labor Day, which is next week, Monday, September 4th, Labor Day, as we all know, is the federal holiday in the United States, celebrating the American labor movement and the contributions of all workers to this great country. I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about the topic of work, which figures very centrally into Catholic social teaching. Before theorizing about work itself, though, I thought I'd pitch you a softball and ask you about your own work history. What was your first job, or any memorable jobs before you entered the world of academia?
Yeah, my first job was Crocs and Bertano's bookstore in Oak Brook, Illinois. I was 16. My brother was working there. Crocs and Bertano is gone now. There was a great kind of flagship store in downtown Chicago, and then there were about 20-some branches of it all over the Chicago area. And I worked in the branch in Oak Brook Shopping Center, and I was a stock boy. So it was my last couple years of high school. And my job was basically to take in, the books would arrive like in the loading dock, and we'd bring them up, and then we'd have to process the books and get them in various places. And so it was sort of a half intellectual, half manual labor kind of job, because there's a lot of carrying boxes around and, doing a fair amount of busy work. I must say I loved it. I was busy in those days. I went to high school all day, and then I would get in the car and I'd drive to Oak Brook, which is about a half hour from my high school, and then I would work from, I don't know, like 4 or 4:30 until 9, and then I would, drive home and then start the day. It might have, maybe I think now it was maybe 2 or 3 days a week I did that. But it was a busy life. But I enjoyed that job. I worked at Steak and Shake. I think those are gone now. There was a chain of restaurants. And I worked there for 3 days one summer because I was a dishwasher. And it was like this super hot summer. And I was in the back in the kitchen with one of those old-fashioned dishwashing machines, blazingly hot. And I hung in there for like 3 days, and I said, no, I can't take this, and I quit. But my first job was Crocs and Bertano's bookstore, which I loved.
Was that the setting for the famous story where you were quite literally hit upon by a flying copy of Merton's Seven Story Mountain?
My brother came into the stock room in the back, and in those days, if a book had been on the shelf too long or was damaged or something, they would take a paperback, take the cover off of it, and they'd send that somewhere, and then the book was just available. So it was a coverless paperback of the Seven Story Mountain, and he threw it at me, and I was sitting there, and he said, "You'll like this, it's by a Trappist monk." And I said, "I don't want to read a book by some Buddhist." And he said, "Trappists are Catholics, you idiot." And that's how I got the book, which had a big impact on my life. It's, it's a bit like a Flannery O'Connor story, I suppose.
All right, let's turn to the topic of work in the context of Catholic social teaching.
Yeah.
Now, I want to give a quote here from Pope Francis, his recent encyclical Amoris Laetitia. He says, "It is clear from the very first pages of the Bible that work is an essential part of human dignity. There we read that," and he's quoting from Genesis, "the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. Man is presented as a laborer who works the earth, harnesses the forces of nature, and produces the bread of anxious toil."
Mm-hmm.
Does this mean that work is a good thing and not just a product or a punishment of the fall?
Right. I mean, that we sort of labor and work is something that's terribly difficult. You could say that's a function of the fall. But work itself exists before the fall. So Adam tilling the garden is a symbol here of all the ways that human beings, made in God's image and likeness, transform creation. They work creation so as to make it even more beautiful and life-giving and so on, cooperating thereby with the creativity of God. And, Brandon, we all live in a fallen world. We're all sinners, so we know the shadow side of it. We know the laborious side of work. But we also know this, that the way you feel at the end of the day after a good day's work, and there's nothing like it. Like, contrast, we talk about my vacations, like a vacation day, which is great. We're all in favor of vacations. But the way you feel at the end of a day of vacation, and you're sitting on the deck at your house or something, contrast that with sitting on the deck with a cool drink after a good day's work. There's something that's more satisfying, isn't there, about that second one? Because we know that work has drawn something out of us. It has produced something in the world that didn't exist before. Talk to anyone who's an inventor or an entrepreneur, someone that invents a business, creates something of value in the world. Well, that's like just permanently satisfying state of affairs. And then even the way that your body is involved, you call upon the energies and skill of your own body when you work. I like to, John Paul II, who was so sensitive to these issues, talked about the academic person going to his intellectual workbench. And that phrase has stayed in my mind ever since I read it, because that's a lot of my job, is to go to a desk with a computer and I'm writing and so on. And to see that not as some kind of effete, elitist sort of thing to do, but I'm going to my intellectual workbench, like someone who's cobbling shoes. Well, I'm cobbling a text, or I'm cobbling a talk or something. Work is beautiful as it calls forth our creativity, engages our energies, and produces something really new and beautiful in the world. See, because I've said this a million times, God does not compete with us. God has zero interest. He has nothing to gain from us. So he wants just to give to us. He wants us to participate in his causality and his creativity. And that's what work is at its best.
I think most of us grasp the basic dimension and purpose of work, which is we work so we can earn money to provide needs for ourselves and for those we support. However, for Catholicism, work is more than just its functional dimension. It's a form of participation in God's own creation. Can you talk about the distinctively Christian understanding of work? How does it make us co-creators with God?
Yeah, because think of this in Aquinas. Thomas says that God makes the world indeed good and very good, but he doesn't make it finished. And I think people miss that point a lot. All they see is, there's the perfectly finished world, and then we fell from that perfection. That's not really the image. The image is God makes the world good, indeed very good, but then he allows for its development. So this whole kind of evolutionary consciousness that we have now, to my mind, is perfectly congruent with the Bible, that the world good, but now continues to sort of unfold according to an evolutionary process. In a similar way, we make the world better. So it's good, how lovely nature is. But see, if we just sat back and ate grapes and looked how beautiful nature is, well, we get bored after a while, and the world would not be as beautiful as it could be, because our job is to work with nature, and I'll bring all Laudato Si into it, respectfully, not in a exploitative way, not aggressively. Think of your friend Tolkien. We don't want to become like Sauron or like Saruman, destroying the natural world. No, but working with it in a way that's deeply respectful and participating, as you suggest, in the very creativity of God, we enhance the world. We make it better. And then press it a little bit. So not just think of an artist or a farmer, but think of an entrepreneur, someone who is making a business. Think of all the ways that human work has improved the lot of human beings. The fact that here you and I are, we're thousands of miles apart, and we're talking effortlessly to each other through these elaborately complicated machines. Well, there's an enhancement of life that was made possible by the work of like millions of people that produce these very lights that are shining at me right now in this very machine into which I'm talking. That's beautiful. And think now of all the great companies and corporations that provide, food and shelter and clothing and entertainment. Beautiful, beautiful. They've enhanced life. That's the purpose of work. All of that is the descendant of Adam tilling the soil of the garden prior to the fall. And think of all the people that made these lights and cameras and microphones and everything, that at the end of their long day of work, I hope they sat down in their easy chair and had a cool drink and said, yeah, it was a good day of work today. I produced something of real value, Like I wonder the people that literally made these lights and microphones and stuff, maybe some of them were Catholics. I wonder if it ever occurred to them, hey, I'm actually making a camera that's going to be used for evangelization. I just made a microphone through which words of the gospel are going forth into the world. So, that's work at its best, right? That's what work is meant to be, that it makes the already good world better. It makes our psyches healthier, makes our bodies healthier. John Paul was very good on that because he did a lot of manual labor as a young man, in the quarry and factories and so on. He knew about that, the literal sweat of your body. Okay. You feel good after a day of work like that. Those are all the ways, I think, Brandon, that we can develop a spirituality of work.
I know for centuries, Christian laborers working in their fields, plying their trades, have been inspired by the fact that Jesus, the God they worship, was also a worker. We know from the Gospels that for decades Jesus worked in the carpenter shop in Nazareth with his father. What is the significance that the founder of Christianity was himself a carpenter, a worker?
Yeah, it's tremendously powerful. One of the things, and I guess it's just per force it is this way, that we don't think about that much are the hidden years of Jesus. They're hidden, so there's not much we know. But it's interesting to speculate about that for the vast majority of his short life, he lives to be only, let's say, around 30 or so. But for the vast majority of that, he lives in privacy with his parents in this little nothing town of Nazareth, first century Nazareth. It couldn't get more primitive in a way. And what's he doing? He's a carpenter, a tekton, the Bible says. So some kind of a producer, laborer that makes things. Not exactly sure what that means, but that his body was involved, his hands, his mind, to create things and design them, dealing with payments, and that guy's late with his money, and how about I haven't sent the bill yet to her, and all of the little details of the life of a laborer. Beautiful. The Word made flesh deigned for the vast majority of his adult life to live precisely that way, thereby sanctifying it. So everything we've just talked about is sanctified because Jesus himself lived that life and practiced those activities. I think that's beautiful. I love that. The simplicity of it, the literally hands-on quality of Jesus' work. He wasn't like a sage who just escaped to a mountaintop and then said, wise things. But for most of his life, adult life, he was, and probably as a kid, apprenticing to his father, learning the trade. As your kids watch you and learn, things, there's Jesus learning from Joseph in his humanity. So anyway, I think that's a very beautiful thing for Christians to reflect on. And there's no work that's too, humble or denigrating, or, the Son of God did very simple work.
When most people reflect on Catholic social teaching, they trace its origin, at least modern Catholic social teaching, back to the release of Rerum Novarum. It was an encyclical published by Pope Leo XIII in the year 1891, and this first encyclical that launched this modern tradition dealt with the topic of work. I know it's been one that you've pointed to often in your work. Can you tell us a little bit about Rerum Novarum?
Yeah, it's a great text, a revolutionary text. Here's the thing, Brandon, about Rerum Novarum that I think people don't reflect on enough. it's coming up out of a very volatile time in European history. So Marx writes the Communist Manifesto, 1848, the year of revolution. And Europe was rocked in the ensuing decades by a lot of revolutionary violence, much of it on behalf of oppressed workers. Now, were workers oppressed? You bet they were. I mean, see, we take for granted child labor laws, minimum wage requirements, limited workday, unionization, antitrust legislation, all these ways that a capitalist political economy has been limited by law. And so we take them for granted. We applaud all those limitations. Well, think of a time when none of that existed, when there was a kind of rampaging, untrammeled capitalism that was extremely oppressive to workers. So Marx articulates it, now in an exaggerated way and backed up by a very inadequate ideology, yes. But the issue that he raises, nevertheless, is a legitimate one. What do we do about so many workers who are now being oppressed and living in horrible conditions, working under horrible conditions? So Leo XIII writes this text kind of at the culminating moment of that time. And he is taking very seriously the critiques of people like Marx and the concern raised by people like Marx, even as he distances himself clearly from Marxist solutions to it. Okay, so I think that's Rerum Novarum, is the church looking very seriously and honestly at this problem of the exploitation of workers. And, Marx, to his credit, wanted to restore workers to their dignity. He wanted to, that they be creative, that they be close to nature, that they find themselves, they're not alienated through their work, all of that. And I think that positive side of the Marxist critique finds its way into Catholic social teaching, without going down the road at all of the Marxist ideology and all that. And dare I say it, you can find some of that in Laborem Exercens, 1981, written on the 90th anniversary of Rerum Novarum by John Paul II, who as a young man lived in Marxist Poland, and as a scholar knew Marx very well. The famous story that when he went into the conclave and elected him Pope in 1978, for his reading material, he brought a Marxist journal. So John Paul II knew the Marxist theorists, and you can find some of that, I would say, positive affirmation of Marx's concern about the struggle of workers in Laborem Exercens, even as he clearly backs away from a Marxist solution. So I think that's an important theme in Catholic social teaching.
I wanted to mention that a couple of years ago, Word on Fire published this beautiful collection as part of our Word on Fire Classics series, but it's the Catholic Social Teaching Collection. It has the full text of Rerum Novarum. If you haven't read it, it's not long. In this book, it's only 38 pages long. You can read it in maybe one or two sittings. But I encourage you, check this out if you want to read the actual text behind the Catholic social teaching tradition. Bishop, as we get near to the end here, I want to highlight two different saints who are often associated with the Church's concern for work and workers, Dorothy Day and St. Jose Maria Escriva. Let's start with Dorothy Day. So as a young radical, Dorothy Day, who ended up being the foundress of the Catholic worker movement, found it difficult to abandon her sympathies for communism and Marxism in order to eventually convert to Catholicism, in part because it seemed that the communists were standing more strongly on behalf of workers. But she came to see that, in fact, the Catholic Church offered an even stronger defense. How have Catholics defended the rights of workers, especially over the last couple hundred years?
Well, you see it in the social teaching tradition. So in Rerum Novarum, for example, the strong advocacy for unions, which was pretty radical at the time. Or you see in Quadragesimo Anno, which means on the 40th year, and it was written on the 40th, 1931, Pius XI. And, there you find the focus on subsidiarity and the importance of the local control. And that's not just a political, that's an economic category too. Read again, your friends like Lewis and Tolkien and Chesterton were very strong on subsidiarity, distributism, and all that. And those were very pro-worker. In fact, I happened to stumble on it just the other night. There was the very first of the Lord of the Rings films, and And when you watch, Saruman and the destruction of nature and the exploitation, the workers that he creates out of the earth who are just like slaves of his economic and military and political ends. It's a poetic exaggeration, but that's what Tolkien and company saw in excessive forms of capitalism. It doesn't respect the local community, doesn't respect nature, doesn't respect the integrity and freedom of the worker, all of that. So that side of Catholic social teaching, you want to call it left wing, well, that's left wing. It doesn't favor an untrammeled capitalism, doesn't favor a completely free market system. It wants to see both a moral and legal restriction of those realms. So I think that's an important caution. People like Dorothy Day, I think, would have deeply appreciated that too. Look at her paper. It's called The Catholic Worker. So you're right. She wanted to advocate the rights and dignity of the worker, but within a Catholic context, not a communist context. She probably did see that in our country, some of the communists and socialists were more attentive to the needs of workers than capitalists. Now we can quarrel with Dorothy Day and say, well, she leaned too far left in her theorizing. Fair enough. But the principle, I think, is an altogether valid one. Who's the other figure you mentioned? Dorothy Day? Yeah, and Escrivá.
Escrivá, a different figure. He's a priest and a spiritual master, founder of Opus Dei. He devoted much of his life to developing a spirituality of work and helping especially laymen to find God in their work, not separating the two. I have work over here and church life over here. Here's a good quote from him. He wrote, quote, "Your ordinary contact with God takes place where your fellow men, your yearnings, your work, and your affections are. There you have your daily encounter with Christ. In the midst of the most material things of the earth, there is where we must sanctify ourselves, serving God in all mankind." How can we find God in our work?
Well, I think Escrivá is interesting because his Opus Dei emerges out of the time of the Spanish Civil War, when there was this great battle between a more right-wing militaristic, setup and then a communist setup, a socialist. And so he's sensitive to that battle. And I think you can hear in that language a deep concern about workers and about ordinary people. He doesn't want them to be set aside. And I think it's what we talked about earlier, is that you're doing the simplest task, but you do it well, you do it with intelligence, with dedication, with creativity, with a sense of the value to another. That's altogether dignified, that work. That takes on a spiritual quality that it wouldn't otherwise. So I think it's come up out of your life of prayer and then apply that to whatever the Lord has given you to do. And never say, oh, this is, what good is this? No, it belongs to the very creativity of God, participates in it. And God has given you this work to do on behalf of people. And it might be, putting together a camera, it might be sewing clothes, but whatever it is you're doing, if it's done with dignity and with truth and with a sense of its loving purpose, that's beautiful, that's sanctified. I think that's how Escrivá would have seen it.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. Today we have a question about the topic of transcendence and how it differs from immanence. Here's the question.
Hello, Bishop Barron. You often use the term transcendent or transcendence. It seems like such words are used to point to things or phenomena that exist outside of this world, but it is difficult to derive a clear definition of these terms. Can you please explain what you mean by the transcendent, for example, contrasting this with the opposite term of immanence? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. One way to do it is use Kantian language, the categorical. That's the world that I can categorize. So the world of ordinary experience, I can compare this to that. I can say this being belongs in this category, that being in another category. The categorical world is the world of ordinary sense experience, and so on. The transcendent is what lies beyond that. So remember this line from Hegel, to know a limit as a limit is already to be beyond the limit. So the fish in the water doesn't know his watery world as a limit. It's only if he's drawn up beyond it. Let's say he's fished out of the water, and for a moment he goes beyond it, and this new world has opened up, and then he goes back into the water. Now he knows his categorical world as limited. That means he's already beyond the limit. So through a number of experiences, the philosophers call them limit experiences, we sense, it's as though we're like a fish that we're drawn up out of the water. Times of intense joy, times of intense sorrow, times of intense loss, times of wonder, the sublime, Kant calls it. When we come to the limit of our ordinary experience, but to know it, see, as a limit is already to be beyond it. That beyond world, which, and you're right in this, that by definition can't be categorized. That's why we start gesturing toward it with poetic talk. Doesn't mean that we've surrendered, as that's the only language we have at that point. But we've noticed that there's something that lies beyond the categorical realm. That's the transcendent. Now, in the ultimate sense, that means God. It means the realm of God. Because God is the unconditioned reality. So God can't be fit into the categorical world at all. God is in his very nature transcendent to that world. And so the transcendent is now a hint. It's a glimpse of the sheer transcendence of God.
Well, thanks for that great question. And as we wrap up here, one more reminder to get your copy of this excellent new book, which just launched today, titled The Theology of Bishop Barron. I think it's called The Theology of Robert Barron is the accurate title. It's written by Matthew Levering, and in many ways, the theology of Robert Barron is the theology of Word on Fire. So if you've been listening and watching Word on Fire and you want to go deeper into this particular ethos, this book offers a great way in. Well, thanks so much for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.